May I have your attention, please? We will soon start today's seminar. Please take your seats so that we can begin. Distinguished guests, let us begin the international seminar to celebrate 2021 P4G Seoul Summit organized jointly by the National Assembly, Forum on Climate Change, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Environment, and the Global Green Growth Institute under the theme of Strategy for Green Transformation and Cooperation for Carbon Neutrality and Achieving SDGs. I'm Im Sung-jo, the Secretary General of NAFCC and today's MC. First part of this opening ceremony, we will have a pledge of allegiance to the nation. Please stand to your feet and face the national flag. Salute. Hands down, please be seated. Time-wise, we will not sing the national anthem. Let me introduce today's VIPs. Today, we are joined by a great number of VIPs. We are joined by Honorable Yu Dong, member of the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea and the co-chair of NAFCC. He has been serving as a co-chair since 2016, and he has been playing a pivotal role in the Ministry of Environment. And we are also joined by Honorable Minister Han Jong-hye of Environment. And we are also joined by Excellency Choi Jong-moon, the Second Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. We are also joined by many speakers and moderators, let me introduce Honorable Frank Rice-Berman, the Director General of Global Green Growth Institute, or GGGI. The moderator of the second session, Honorable Kim Il-jun, co-chair of the Sustainable Development Committee of the City of Seoul. Now we also have the members of NAFCC. We are joined by Honorable Im Jong-sung, a member of the National Assembly. Honorable Yunji, a member of the National Assembly, who is a member of NAFCC. And we are joined by Honorable No Eun-rae, a member of the National Assembly and a member of NAFCC. Last but not least, let me introduce the members of P4G and the excellencies from the embassies. Due to time constraints, I will move on to the next part of the program. Now I'd like to invite Honorable Yu Uidong, who is the co-chair of NAFCC, for his opening remarks. Please welcome him with a big hand. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Yu Uidong, a member of the National Assembly, as well as the co-chair of NAFCC. Back in 2015, the global community, in order to ensure the sustainable development of the nation, made two important commitments, that is Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. The Paris Agreement, till the end of this century, has set forth mid to long-term goals, which calls for the coordinated actions on the part of the developed as well as the developing nations. SDGs are of great importance, not just for the environment, but also for the renewable energy as well as the poverty reduction and sustainable production and consumption. And this goals sets out 17 goals to be achieved by 2030, calling for the implementation as well as the cooperation by the international community. The international community has two important pillars of SDGs and Paris Agreement. Now is the time for us to make dedicated efforts in order to achieve these two goals so that we can maximize the effects. And it is time for us to pursue a strategy for implementation. Today, seminar is prepared to ensure cooperation for achieving SDGs by the international community. I'd like to thank the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the GGGI, as well as all the speakers and discussants. Especially, I'd like to thank all the missions from the embassies in Seoul for their cooperation and active participation. As the co-chair of NAFCC, I will make every effort to fulfill the active role to be played by the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea to ensure carbon neutrality as well as achieving SDGs. I hope for the great success for this seminar. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to the welcoming remarks by the President and Chair of the Council of the Group GGGI, Mr. Pan Gi-moon. Well, he sent us his welcoming message. Let's have a look.
Honorable Yu Uidong, Member of the National Assembly and Co-Chair of the National Assembly Forum on Climate Change, Honorable Kim Sang-hee, Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, Excellency Han Jong-hae, Minister of Environment, Excellency Choi Jong-moon, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation to address the participants of this very important event ahead of the P4G summit. I believe today will be instrumental for sharing ideas and insights for the urgently needed green transformation. As you all know, I had the privilege of serving as the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, which came on the heels of my career as a Korean diplomat for 37 years. And my tenure at the United Nations is often defined by the Paris Climate Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So you may be able to imagine, as the President of the Assembly and Chair of the Council of the Global Green Growth Institute, today I am most pleased that GGGI has partnered with the National Assembly, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Environment of my home country to provide this precious venue for discussions. Therefore, although I am unable to join this event in person, I'd like to extend my deep appreciation to all the organizers and to all the participants for joining us today, whether in person or virtually. Allow me to take a moment and share just a couple of points. Over the last year and 4 or 5 months, the entire global community was reminded of just how vulnerable we really are. The enormous cost in lives, the huge loss in incomes and revenues, the travel restrictions, the complete lockdowns, and social distancing measures, and the evidence of mental and psychological strains showing up in the form of random violence, increased suicide rates, and much more. They all demonstrated, seemingly overnight, that we human beings are not as invincible as we sometimes like to think of ourselves. And let us make no mistake about it. There is certainly a correlation between the climate change phenomena and the COVID-19 pandemic. But as many parts of the world are finally emerging, we're starting to see the end of pandemic on the horizon. Allow me to remind us all, there is no vaccine for the climate crisis we have created. Perhaps one of the greatest weaknesses of humankind is that our memories are at times too short. I hope all of us lawmakers, diplomats, environment experts, corporate leaders, and private citizens can work together, make sure that we do not go back to business as usual. As the world plans to come out of the unprecedented challenges of the pandemic, we must do what is necessary to green our recovery efforts and build back better. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, if we, as a global community, fail to seize this opportunity now, if we succumb to our short-term memory and forget about the important wake-up call this time, or if we give in to the temptation to take the easier and more familiar path of continuing as before, I dare say that our failure to learn from our mistakes and take corrective actions to prevent future repeats, that will be a far worse tragedy than the pandemic itself. For too long, we have ignored the warning signs that our planet has been flashing at us. Let us heed the warnings and work together so we can leave a world to our future generations that is inhabitable and enjoyable, not a world that resembles those dark, apocalyptic science fiction movies. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation, and I wish you all a very green and successful event. Thank you. 감사합니다.
Thank you. We would now like to hear from the Honorable Kim Sang-hee, Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea. Because she is currently on a state visit, we have received a congratulatory message from her as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Kim Sang-hee, Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea. I extend my heartfelt congratulations to you on the opening of this international seminar on strategy for green transformation and cooperation for carbon neutrality and achieving SDGs, held by the National Assembly Forum on Climate Change, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Environment, and the Global Green Growth Institute. With the Our Common Future report that came out in 1987, the international community has come together to adopt and implement global goals to solve the common challenges that we face in the fields of the environment, economy, and society. For the years from 2016 to 2030, advanced economies and developing nations have cooperated to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals under the slogan of leaving no one behind. However, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been persisting for over a year, has been a severe obstacle to the implementation of SDGs, and it has been wreaking havoc across the entire world. Moreover, problems in healthcare, medicine, poverty, and human rights due to the pandemic have occurred first among the more vulnerable members of the population, leading to worsening social inequality and polarization. Currently, countries around the world are responding to this crisis by working on vaccinations as well as economic recovery and rebuilding. Advanced nations have recently been announcing the implementation of green recovery and green new deals. With the implementation of the Paris Agreement, the call towards carbon neutrality has become a key issue, particularly this year, demanding more transitional policies to support a transition to eco-friendly social structure and the establishment of a healthy ecosystem. The SDGs can help us overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, but also be a fundamental solution to responding to global climate crisis and transitioning to a sustainable society. This seminar, which is being hosted before next week's 2021 P4G Seoul Summit, will hopefully allow us to engage in discussions for effective cooperation and also build a wide consensus among us for carbon neutrality and SDG implementation. I'd like to thank Dong, MP of the National Assembly and co-chair of the NAFCC, Pan Ki-moon, chair of the Council of GGGI, Han Jong-ae, Minister of the Environment and co-chair of the NAFCC, and members of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you also to the speakers and panelists from the public sector, local governments, industry, civil society, research institutions, and the youth community who have taken valuable time out of their schedules to be with us today. The National Assembly of the Republic of Korea will also support your journey towards a green transition of net zero and towards SDGs through aggressive legislative efforts. Thank you very much. We would now like to hear from Her Excellency Han Jong-ae, Minister of the Environment of the Republic of Korea. It is a pleasure to meet you. I'm Han Jong-ae, the Minister of Environment. Dong, Member of the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea. Jong, Second Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, and distinguished speakers from various missions and embassies across the Republic of Korea. And I would also like to thank His Excellency Pan Ki-moon, Chair of the Council of the GGGI, and Kim Sang-hee, Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly. This forum has a very long history. Park Bum-seok, the Speaker of the National Assembly, and the Deputy Speaker are also members of this current forum. Climate change response and sustainable development go hand in hand. In 1992, sustainable development was discussed in Brazil as a way to preserve the earth environment, and That was what led to the launch of the Paris Agreement, and now we have come under the conclusion that we cannot have sustainable development without carbon neutrality. This means that carbon neutrality is not something that we should take lightly, and that we all have to commit ourselves to this. And this carbon neutrality is something that we have to achieve under the framework of sustainable development. That is why we are pursuing this together, and local governments also have announced their local Green New Deals, along with the National Green New Deal that was proposed by the Korean government, and this is a measure of actionable goals. Local governments and the private sector are all working towards green transition, and these efforts cannot be understated. The P4G summit, which is going to be on next week, 243 different local governments and different civil society members have come together to come up with a list of goals and action items that they can work on. The Ministry of Environment will also continue to lend its support toward these efforts. For businesses and the finance sector, they can participate voluntarily in green finance schemes. Global financial institutions have recently been focusing on ESG and related investments, so we would also like to help our Korean corporations address this through a taxonomy and different other relevant efforts, and that is what the Ministry of Environment is working towards. For us to work towards carbon neutrality and SDGs, the government will spare no effort in providing the support framework. This strategies for inclusive growth and carbon neutrality. I hope that this seminar is going to be a way for us to engage in consensus with relevant institutions, civil society, governments, and also from the public sector. Before I end, I want to talk a little bit about the honeybee. Yesterday I was watching TV, and I saw a story about a farmer, a honeybee farmer who goes around picking honeybees from acacia plants. And this farmer said that about 20 years ago, when acacia flowers bloom, it takes about a month for the acacia flowers to come to bloom in the south and move their way up in the north. So it typically takes about a month for this process to occur. But recently, the cycle of these acacia flowers blooming from the southernmost tip of the country to the northernmost tip only takes place at about 2 weeks time frame. So for these honeybee farmers who take the honey from acacia flowers, have to go to the south, harvest the bees, harvest the honey, and by the time they moved up to the middle of the country around Chungju, the acacia flowers have already fallen out of bloom, that they have already died in the northern regions. This is something that we're seeing not just in Korea but elsewhere. And for us to just look at all of these problems very locally on a very microscopic level, we cannot resolve all of the problems together. So what we have left to do is to try to move as quickly as we can and achieve carbon neutrality ASAP so that we can prevent the global temperatures from rising any higher than it can. That is literally going to shape our future, not just for honeybees, but for our very survival. So I hope that that is what we'll keep in mind as we go into the P4G summit and as we shape different policies. And when we can think about these different things, then we can create a sustainable future for all of us. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we would like to hear from Jong, Second Vice Minister of the Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. Please give him a big round of applause. Honorable Yu Dong, Member of the National Assembly and Co-Chair of NAFCC, MP Yu, MP Lee, Pan Ki-moon, 8th Secretary General of the UN, Han Jong-hae, Minister of Environment, and members of diplomatic missions, distinguished guests. The world currently is still undergoing the COVID-19 tunnel with no end in sight. Many people are undergoing economic difficulties. Our neighbors are isolated and quarantined, and many people are suffering from the lack of medical facilities. However, in spite of this, we are here to discuss hope and recovery. Because the choices we make today will shape the world after the crisis. We can make a better tomorrow and a greener, more competitive society for the future. And with those hopes and those desires in mind, the Korean government announced the Korean Green New Deal in July of last year as a key policy for us to help recover the COVID-19 pandemic. And in October, we also announced our plan to be carbon neutral by 2050. We want to take these current challenges and turn them into an opportunity for a futuristic, eco-friendly industries and new jobs. Our government is also ready and willing to share our experiences on the Green New Deal and policy measures for carbon neutrality with developing nations. We are also going to cooperate with GGGI, which is an international organization that works on green growth policies to identify growth engines for developing nations and strengthen their climate response capacity. Distinguished guests, carbon neutrality is also reshaping industries and also reshaping economic norms. There's changes in competition in certain industries related to energy and automobiles. Korean businesses have to preemptively prepare for carbon neutral era and enter a green market. Fortunately, the market is moving very quickly. Global investors are looking at renewable energy 100 accomplishment for these different businesses and also requiring them to enhance their ESG indicators. And the corporations that cannot respond to these changes are seeing their valuations go down. We have to respond to climate change and achieve sustainable development together. And this is something that the government and private sector have to work together on. The government, corporations, and civil society have to work together to engage in innovation and create actionable change. And the future generation has to be with us as well. We have to listen to the voices of the youth and have that reflected in climate action. This is the reason Korea is participating actively in the P4G initiative. The P4G allows governments and private sector to be partners and support projects that will make effective achievements in the field of green growth and also allow for these success cases to be spread globally. We share the vision of P4G, and also that is why at the end of this month we are hosting the 2021 P4G Summit here in Seoul under the theme of Inclusive Green Recovery towards Carbon Neutrality. Representatives from 40 different countries and 20 different international organizations, leaders, and other representatives will come together to discuss global efforts for carbon neutrality and green recovery. Distinguished guests, this year, 2021, is year one of the 10-year implementation of the Paris Agreement. If we want to avoid a massive climate disaster on a scale that is unprecedented, we have to look 10 years into the future and engage in the appropriate action and implementation. In the 2021 P4G Seoul Summit, I hope that we can have many different discussions. And today as well, through the seminar, we can have many different discussions by relevant experts on a sustainable future. Thank you very much. As the last part of this opening ceremony, I'd like to ask all of the distinguished guests and speakers and panelists and representatives from the diplomatic missions across Korea to please come forward and take a group photo. Please step forward. Thank you very much. that, we would like to move into the first session of today's seminar. This first session is titled Strategies for Linking NDCs with SDGs to Cope with Global Challenges. We would like to begin the first session shortly. I'd like to ask our moderator and the presenters and the panelists to please come forward. The first session will be moderated by Frank Reisbrunn, Director General of the Global Green Growth Institute. I'd like to ask all the presenters and panelists for the first session to please step forward.
Very good. If you're ready, honorable members of the National Assembly, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our first session and discuss a few of the key issues that we'll be addressing during this panel. In the first place, of course, we're talking about the implementation of NDCs and SDGs, but in the context of the pandemic and the economic crisis caused by the pandemic. And the question that has been on many people's minds is, can we build back better? Governments have mobilized trillions of dollars to fight the economic crisis linked to the pandemic, but unfortunately so far only a relatively small share of that stimulus funding has actually been green. Of course, the critical question is, can the money used to recover from the pandemic be at the same time helping to accelerate climate action? And at the heart of that question is the belief that certainly GGI has, and that many other studies have supported as well, is that those green investments that accelerate climate action are also generating more jobs, more green jobs through green investments, which means that the number one priority for recovery from the pandemic-caused crisis, to have more green jobs, can indeed be achieved through accelerated climate action. And I think that is a question to be explored in more detail. Even during the COVID pandemic, work has continued on more ambitious NDCs. That is a top priority of the next COP, COP26 in the UK, and we are very happy to have a representative of the COP president here with us today. So yes, quite a few countries have submitted their revised NDCs, but an analysis of the UN shows that these are not yet ambitious enough to meet the Paris Agreement. So that is really the question. Can the commitments for 2030 as a key stepping stone to 2050 be credible to show that we can go net zero? And yes, in Korea, GGI and the Climate Change Center organized a campaign last year to advocate for net zero and blue skies. And the key objectives we had there was for the government of Korea to declare a commitment to net zero, and for Korea internationally to stop funding of coal-fired power plants. So of course we were very happy that despite the pandemic we had quite a few meetings, including with quite a few of the embassies and organizations here in the room, most of them hybrid, a few people that you see here in the photos in the room, and many more people online. And indeed we have had more than 40 organizations join this campaign for Blue Skies and Net Zero in Korea, showing a very strong support. And we'll have another session next week where civil society will discuss, as we are here today, how Korea can step up. Of course, we were extremely happy that President Moon was one of the leaders that did combine green recovery, fight against the pandemic with climate action through the Digital and Green New Deal in July last year, that he made that commitment for net zero by 2050 in October last year, and more recently at President Biden's Climate Leaders Summit, formally announced Korea's end to financing coal projects internationally. So the next key steps are, the President said in April that this year Korea will announce a more ambitious NDC, so that's what we are waiting for. And given that the US has committed to 50%, the EU is at 50%, Japan announced 46%, yes, the hope, the desire, the request to the government of Korea and to you as members of the National Assembly is, can Korea commit to 50% emission reduction by 2030? That is the milestone that is considered to be a good stepping stone to net zero by 2050. And if Korea does so, then can Korea play a leading role in Asia to convince other countries, key partners of Korea like Vietnam and Indonesia, countries that have not yet committed to net zero and that are huge coal users? Can Korea use its influence, its strong partnership, its strong direct investment, and its ODA to convince those countries to join the race to net zero? And yes, I think that would mean that instead of exporting coal-fired power plants, Korea has a real opportunity to export green technology, to have a larger share of its ODA be 50%. So those are key questions. How rapidly can Korea step up? And for Korea itself, yes, I think you know that the government has had major efforts in renewable energy, focus on solar and wind. Potentially an area that we could discuss today is what the potential is for green hydrogen, whether green hydrogen can come out of research and development and into commercialization, and whether even green hydrogen can be used, can be produced with, for instance, hydropower from Laos or Indonesia, turn into hydrogen and shipped to Korea to help reduce the fossil fuel use in industry and in hard-to-abate sectors. I think that's a key issue to discuss quite seriously. Now, while the EU and Korea have Green New Deals, many of GHI's member countries are asking whether a Green New Deal is also relevant for other countries. We believe that it is, that actually Green New Deals and green recovery is also important for developing and emerging economies, and that that indeed represents a real opportunity for Korea to be a leader in Asia and in the world. There are green investments going on, but they should be catalyzed, they should be stepped up to be relevant. And I just wanted to give one example. In India, because of the terrible toll the pandemic has taken, as you know, in recent weeks, even during the pandemic, green big projects continued in India. We were involved in solarizing a highway, for instance. That was the first step, combining major green energy with a traditional infrastructure project. And that same highway now we are looking at, can it be made ready for electric mobility? Those are the kind of projects that I believe are also real opportunities for Korean industry to share its technology internationally. One area that I also hope will come up today is not only supplying more green energy, but to reduce the demand for energy, and particularly energy efficiency in buildings seems to be an area that can be stepped up internationally and in Korea as well. And finally, maybe less in Korea, but certainly in Africa or even in the Philippines, climate smart agriculture and working with small and medium enterprises in rural areas that can create jobs, jobs for young people, jobs for the next generation, while at the same time adapting to climate change is a critical issue internationally as well. So that leaves us, I think, with a number of questions that I hope the speakers in this session will focus on. Can the recovery from COVID-19 be green in Korea and abroad? Can we indeed achieve net zero by 2050 in Korea, and how will Korea make a strong NDC commitment by 2030? Can it lead in Asia? Can Korea green its ODA and work with the private sector to green its foreign direct investment in Asia? And what can Korea do to support countries like the small island development state and least developed countries that need to adapt to climate change? And finally, what can be achieved at the P4G summit to make the summit a success? So we have an excellent panel already lined up here on the stage, and we begin with two speakers to introduce this subject, beginning with Helen Manford, a friend and colleague from the World Resources Institute. She is the Vice President for Climate and Economics and an eminent voice internationally to argue how indeed growth can be green, how in the new economy climate action can be a real driver of economic growth. And she will indeed, I think, address some of these key questions up here. And then next we have Ambassador Simon Smith, Ambassador of the UK to Korea. Also, of course, the UK is the COP26 president, so I'm sure he'll share some of those expectations from the UK that Korea and other countries will hopefully live up to by the end of the year. Those are the two first speakers, and then we'll get into the panel after that. Can we invite Helen to start her speech? I'm leaving it to our technical colleagues to start the speech for Helen Manford.
I will assume you can hear me. It's a great honor to be here with you today. Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to join you here to celebrate through this international seminar, the P4G 2021 summit, which will be held next week in Seoul. What I want to speak to briefly today is how we can strengthen a green recovery and the progress that we are already seeing in terms of a green recovery, how this links to climate neutrality, the net zero goals, strengthening the 2030 NDCs, and also achieving the SDGs, how these connect together. Next slide, please. So one thing I do want to emphasize is the toll that the COVID-19 pandemic has already been having on the Sustainable Development Goals and what we're trying to achieve. We know there have been at least 164 million cases of COVID worldwide so far, 3.4 million deaths according to official records, and according to estimated excess deaths, it may well have been 10 million so far from COVID-19. But this has had impacts across the board. It's had impacts in terms of being the worst economic recession since the Great Depression. It has led to many more people in extreme poverty. We have seen impacts on children unable to go to school or interrupted in immunization programs, and of course on women who have been most of those who have lost employment or income and had other consequences as well. So we're already seeing the impacts of COVID-19 across the board on the Sustainable Development Goals. The question now is, how can we use the opportunity of coming out of the COVID crisis to really build back better and to do a green recovery? Next slide, please. And when we look at how we're doing across countries at the moment in terms of the greenness of the recovery packages, it's actually a very mixed picture. So this slide shows you across a number of different countries, we see about roughly 30% of the recovery packages which have any environmental impact, and some of these are greener than others. Anything that is below the zero mark, the stimulus index, the green stimulus index, where there's a dot below, that shows that it's on balance, a little bit dirtier. Anything above that shows that it's getting a bit greener. If you go to the next slide. The good news is, as shown by this slide, as we progress through the COVID crisis, as there are further stimulus bills and economic recovery, we're actually seeing that countries are going greener. They're learning the benefits and the opportunities of a green recovery, while some of the initial investments were very much about bailing out heavy industries, coal-fired plants, oil and gas industries, the aviation industry. As we have progressed through the economic recovery packages from COVID-19, we've been moving towards much, much greener spending. And you can see this through the green arrows on this slide. There's a few countries that have not gone greener, but most around the world have been going greener in their recovery. Next slide. And why is this? This is because of the realization of the benefits of a green recovery, the economic benefits and the job benefits. This slide, which comes from work by the IEA and IMF, shows how investing in green recovery can actually lead to economic growth, faster economic growth and recovery than alternatives, and can create a much better future. Next slide. As you will see here, it is also a much better accelerator of job creation compared to alternatives. Frank mentioned the importance of energy efficiency. We know that building efficiency, that investing in solar photovoltaics, investing in urban transport infrastructure, public transport, and walking and bicycle paths actually creates 2 or more times jobs compared to the same investments in coal power, in gas power, and in oil as well. Similarly, investing in restoring degraded lands can create as much as 7 times as many jobs as the same kind of investments in fossil fuels. So countries are realizing this around the world, seeing the job opportunity of a green recovery, that it can create more jobs directly from the same investments, and starting to seize those opportunities. Next slide. And this has led to a realization that we can step up a climate ambition. Even during the midst of this pandemic, we have seen a movement from countries, from companies, from investors to adopt net zero targets, even in the midst of the economic and the health and the social crisis we are facing. So we now have 59 countries with over 54% of global greenhouse gas emissions that have some formal pledge or law or policy adopted around a net zero target around the world. So this is something which has happened very much in the last 1 to 2 years. These are the countries represented there. Next slide. And you can see that in terms of the target dates, the vast majority are aiming to get to net zero by around 2050, including South Korea. And we want to congratulate and thank South Korea for that commitment to reach net zero by 2050. There are some countries that are now aiming for net zero before 2050 and a couple after. But the vast majority are aiming for around 2050, which is where the science tells us we need to be in order to keep global warming to manageable levels. Next slide. And it is not only the countries that are doing so. We've also seen an incredible outpouring of commitments towards net zero from companies. We have over 1,400 companies that are committed to science-based targets, many of them looking at how to get to net zero. This includes 22% of global Fortune 500 companies. We also have the fantastic initiative announced just a couple of weeks ago, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which brings together asset owners, asset managers, and banks responsible for $70 trillion of assets globally that have committed that their pipeline of investments will be entirely net zero by 2050. And they are looking to apply science-based approaches to the pathways to achieve net zero, to set up interim targets themselves, to cover all emission scopes, and to committed to transparent reporting and accountability. So exciting movements, not just from the countries, but also from companies and from the finance sector. Next slide, please. Of course, these net zero commitments are incredibly important, but as Frank mentioned, the next step once you have these net zero commitments, like South Korea does, is to actually ensure that you update and enhance the 2030 targets under the Paris Agreement to ensure that you are on a strong pathway to actually achieve those net zero targets. And now the world is looking to South Korea and to the other countries that have set net zero targets to enhance and update their NDCs, their 2030 climate targets under the Paris Agreement, to align with these. Already, we have 81 countries globally that have committed to net zero, that have committed to updated 2030 NDCs, and we're looking towards more to do so in the coming weeks and months. We're hoping with President Moon's visit with President Biden later this week, climate change will be a major discussion at their meeting and their discussions there, and that with the P4G summit next week, that might be an opportunity for South Korea to announce an ambitious new 2030 target. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what can we achieve? How is this actually helping to shift the needle in terms of the climate action that we need? Well, what we know is that the pledges under the Paris Agreement so far have put us on track for something similar to about a 2.4 degrees Celsius trajectory, somewhere around there. And this is better than the current policies. Without the Paris Agreement targets, we are going to be on track for more like 2.9 degree target. But what we need is to actually continue to shift these. And these are we're starting to see the difference in how the net zero targets and the new enhanced NDCs are starting to shift down closer to where we need to be for the Paris target. We're certainly nowhere near the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, but we are in the right direction and moving that way. And the more ambition that can come forward this year, the better we will be in terms of shifting that trajectory. Next slide. But we know we are not yet there. And there's a number of areas where we need much stronger, much faster action in order to actually get on track. And these are some of the areas and some of the initiatives that will be discussed at the P4G summit, which can actually help to achieve the kind of stronger action that we need in terms of stepping up electric vehicle use, in terms of shifting much more rapidly away from coal, in terms of renewable energy enhancement, and many others. Next slide, please. One of the key issues that does need to be tackled is really this shift away from coal power. The IEA study this week, which for the first time ever, the IEA really looked at a trajectory that is consistent with the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway, found that no new investments are needed in fossil fuels at all in order to achieve both energy access goals by 2030, but also to align with the 1.5C pathway. And one of the things that is most important is to shift away from coal investment and coal production, coal-based energy production as soon as we possibly can. So the recent announcement by President Moon that Korea will stop any new international financing of coal is extremely important, and an announcement that we hope will be followed by similar announcements from China and from Japan. But also we need to go even further than that. We need to move towards accelerating the phase out of existing coal, helping to ensure a just transition for relevant communities, not just for climate purposes, but also because of the air pollution benefits and what this means in terms of avoiding deaths from air pollution. So a big focus at the moment is going to be that rapid shift away, that phase out of coal plants globally and in particular in Southeast Asia. And South Korea has a very strong role to play in helping to support and accelerate that transition. Thank you. Next slide. So finally, what are we looking for on the road to COP26, and how does this link to this recovery? As I said, one of the most important things now is that countries need to come forward with enhanced 2030 climate targets that align with these ambitious net zero targets. We're seeing many countries have started to come forward with these, including at the time of the Leaders Climate Summit a couple of weeks ago, hosted by President Biden, but we need others to do so, including South Korea. Second, we must globally stop any coal financing, domestic and international, and look at how to more rapidly phase out existing coal. Third, it's absolutely urgent that we need to step up international climate finance to help support developing countries on their transition to a low-carbon economy and in adapting and building resilience to the climate change that is already hitting now. South Korea has been a supporter of the Green Climate Fund and developing countries, and we hope that many others will also come on board and enhance climate finance. And then finally, it's absolutely essential to partner together with the private sector and create the competitive, job-rich economies of the future in the industries that can really shift us into a new green and inclusive economy. South Korea is taking important steps in that direction as part of its recovery, its green recovery and the Green New Deal. And now is the time to step that up even further and move forward towards the economy of the future. Thank you, Frank. I will leave it there. Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all today.
Thank you, Helen. Great speech, as always, and I'm sure you'll also be happy that the Biden administration, your own country, is stepping up and has made such strong commitments as the President did recently. Can we turn to our next speaker, Ambassador Smith? Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Frank. And just to start off with, let me just say what a pleasure it's been to be working on so many things alongside GGGI over the last few years, and a great honor to be participating in this event today. What I'd like to do very briefly today, as has already been mentioned to you, the UK is hosting COP26 in November. We are 6 months away from that now, rather less than 6 months. I'd like to give you a little bit of a flavor of where we feel we are, what's to be happy about, what's to be less happy about, but also just to remind ourselves that, of course, P4G is even closer at hand. We've always seen P4G as one of those key moments on the calendar, which we hope can very significantly add to the sense of momentum that we really need to have generated by the time of COP26 in November this year. And as a forum that concentrates on identifying public-private partnerships, I think P4G can demonstrate extremely well how successful partnerships can map very directly onto the achievement of the SDGs. When you think of the zero hunger, you think of clean water and sanitation, you think of affordable and clean energy, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production. It's really easy to see how these successful public and private partnerships can map onto the SDGs. What is more difficult to see, or it's more difficult to be confident that the collective result of action across the world is going to be sufficient to meet the challenges that are in front of us. So I think P4G can help in showing that it can be done, and I very much hope that one of the results from P4G will be a very clear message to industry in Korea and around the world that action on the climate agenda and accelerating action on the climate agenda, it can be done, and it is not to be feared. It's an opportunity to be embraced, not a difficulty that needs to be ducked or avoided or an objective to be diluted. Now, if I could have the first slide, please. Thank you. That I don't think is my first slide. Sorry, let me just refer. Yeah, thanks very much. Sorry, it is. It is also a slide you've seen before in the last presentation, but none the worse from that. And I think what I want to illustrate here is that we are generating very significant momentum 6 months short of COP26, and there is a sense of changes falling into place on a regular basis. We've seen obviously with the re-engagement of the United States in the global climate agenda, one very significant input into increasing momentum, and against the background of the 22nd of April Climate Summit, again, a number of revised commitments by key emitting countries to help increase that momentum. The UK is amongst those, and I should simply just briefly update for those not aware that we've also announced that we will aim for a 78% reduction by 2035 on our 1990 baseline. So new ambition here is great, but does it actually set us on an assured path to solving the climate crisis? I'm afraid the answer to that question is no. Because, again, as has been explained to you in the previous presentation, this chart is displaying a number of outcomes that are still possible and a number of very seriously damaging outcomes that are still possible if we fail to make sufficient progress on tightening up those commitments. We've seen commitments to 2050 net zero in many countries of the world. Again, that is only to be welcomed, but what we need to see in order to reach this key objective of keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach, and behind that within reach, those words, is a fear that if we do not keep it within reach, if we lose grip on that target, we may rapidly lose grip on a whole range of climatic processes that will make the difficulties we face much graver at a much faster rate than we might have predicted. So that is why I think it's so important to bear in mind that some of these outcomes at the higher range of that temperature range are still possible unless we take sufficient action. To move on to the next slide and just remind ourselves, so next slide please, just to remind ourselves of the difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees. Sorry, can we go back a slide, please? Even in that range, to remind ourselves that the consequences of missing 1.5 and only coming in at 2 are themselves pretty significant and are grave. And that will give us some idea of how much more of a problem we are going to be facing if we overshoot that target by more. So we end up in the range over 2 degrees Celsius. To move, next slide, please. So the question really here is where do we need to see greater ambition? And at this point, it's not a matter actually of pointing fingers at particular climate villains, because the answer to this question, where do we need to see greater ambition, is everywhere. And I think if we can run through, there are some, if you click on next slide, please. We will, and keep clicking, please. So we go through all these, many of these countries here, and we'll see that many of them, even though there may be a carbon neutrality target, there is still significant action that's required, whether it is focus on key sectors of the economy, whether it is the focus on taking quick action to update the existing NDC. There's a whole range of actions which tell us that that long list of countries which you just saw that are committed to 2050 net zero, that is a good position to be in, but it is way short of sufficient in terms of outlining action that we need in order to keep 1.5 Celsius within reach. In the Korean context, obviously, we very much welcome the Korea net zero commitment, and we know that this 2050 net zero commitment in Korea has kicked off a thorough re-examination of Korea's goals, and it's kicked off another look at where Korea could come out with its next NDC. But again, what we will be looking for here in order to be consistent with the 1.5 Celsius objective is looking for a 50% reduction on 2017 levels by 2030 as being the kind of commitment that would be consistent with the objectives that we need to achieve at COP26. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. COP26, as you know, the UK, in partnership with Italy, hosting COP26 this year. And our basic objectives here, I've mentioned the overriding objective of keeping 1.5 Celsius within reach, and the kind of practical issues which we will need to see addressed. Yes, we will need to see more ambitious NDCs in place before COP26. In practice, that means we will need to see countries accelerating the progress of phasing out coal. We'll need to see acceleration in the curtailment of deforestation, speeding up the switch to electric vehicles, more to being done to encourage investment in renewables, all in the service of achieving the 1.5 Celsius target. There will be obviously a very big focus on the need to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. The climate clearly is going to continue to change wherever we get to on that 1.5 degrees Celsius scale or upwards, and it will continue to change as we reduce emissions. And we need, against that background, to work together to enable and encourage countries affected by climate change to protect and restore ecosystems, build defenses, warning systems, resilient infrastructure, and so on. We also need to make a much bigger impact on mobilizing international finance. One clear focus of this is to help developed countries make good, to help developed countries, and for that to happen, then, developing countries, for that to happen, developed countries need to make good on their promise to mobilize at least $100 billion in climate finance per year by 2020. This is a target, having mentioned that, that year, that clearly we are already missing. We need to do better on that. The United Kingdom has committed £11.6 billion of climate finance from 2021 to 2026 in order to supercharge our efforts to achieve the SDGs throughout the world. And we need to work together. We need collaboration right across governments, businesses, civil society, as we finalize the Paris rulebook and decide how it is we are going to implement it successfully. Next slide, please. So progress is needed. Progress has been made, but more is needed. The next couple of slides, I'm just going to illustrate from the UK point of view. My point here is to illustrate both what can be achieved, but also what still needs to be achieved. You'll see from this slide that a great deal of the 41% reduction in emissions achieved by the UK since 1990 has been on the back of phasing out of coal, but you'll see that in so many other of the important areas in which progress needs to be made, the progress as yet is modest. So to move on to the next slide, and this shows in order to meet our 68% emissions reduction by 2030 target, we have to increase those figures on the earlier side very significantly in those key areas. Moving on to the next slide, this is simply to illustrate, again, this is how it looks in one country from the UK. These are the priority areas which we have selected, which we have concluded will be necessary to us to stay on track to achieve the ambitious emissions reduction targets we have set ourselves. But right at the bottom of this list, and it might just as well be right at the top, the green finance and innovation. We regard those things as very much going together and as creating a kind of virtuous circle, because one of the things that our experience has told us, that taking as our starting point, that you not only set objectives, but you attempt to lock them in by making these objectives not simply aspirations, not simply targets, you quite simply make them the law. So the UK, along with a number of other countries around the world, has not simply set targets, it has legislated to make those targets legally binding. And I think that as a result, what we have created is an environment in which the understanding that meeting the targets is not an option, it's the law, is firmly entrenched. But that in itself also generates a great deal more momentum in finance and investment, and again, ideally creates this kind of virtuous circle where we have broken out of the attitude that tells us that action on climate change is a brake on industry, and we have broken into an age where we are convinced that it reminds industry that this is an area full of opportunity and one where increasingly we will see wise and sensible and promising investment move from the fuels of the last century to the fuels of this century. So that is where I will finish now. As I said, I hope I've done a little bit to illustrate where I feel we are 6 months out from COP26, and just to illustrate from the perspective of one country what it is we mean when we say more action is needed and what those actions look like. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Simon. And with that, I think we've had an international perspective, and as you'll have seen in the program and have seen on stage, we have a number of eminent speakers from Korea who hopefully will give us a perspective on whether that international context applies in Korea and whether in a way that high bar set by the recent countries that have made strong commitments can also be realized in Korea. So if we go in the order we have in the program, can we first give the floor to Mr. Lee Dong-kyu, the Director General for Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Scientific Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Dong-kyu, please.
Thank you, Frank. I doubt that I can add something after this kind of a very comprehensive presentation from the prominent our speakers. But I think I can raise several issues from the perspective of Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, especially now even in this morning, I discussed some climate change actions with our colleagues of John Kerry's office in the US to prepare tomorrow's summit. As you know, nowadays the Biden administration very stressed the importance of the climate change issues and put all efforts to increase the climate action, not only in the U.S. and in international fora. So first one is some kind of cooperation between the U.S. and Korea to provide what needed in the developing countries. As the Ambassador Smith highlighted some issues about coal power plant, also Helen highlighted the ending the international financing for the coal power plants. Korea and the US is now talking about some kind of alternative ways. Everybody knows that theoretically green transition is possible, but if we wanted to stop the international financing to the coal power plant in the developing countries, we have to provide some kind of alternative ways. For example, solar powers or the wind powers. But unfortunately, most of developing countries lacks kind of some capacity and experience, and also lacks of the financing. So we will try to find some ways to provide assistance in this kind of aspect, and we think that it will facilitate the phase out of the coal power plant all around the world. Second is maybe a little bit abstractive, but I think the Ambassador Smith stressed the confidence. As I said, the theoretically possible is one, and realization is the other. And we need kind of some confidence. When I talked with my colleagues from the another ministry, for example, Ministry of Industry and the Ministry of Environment, they still a little bit reluctant because they are not sure that we can make some green recovery, or we can meet our targets midterm or the 2050. Korea, yes, you know that nowadays Korea is kind of some good model and good example to make the faster economic development. But still, we need kind of some confidence. Then other developing countries need more confidence and needs more the example. So US and Korea think maybe Korea could be kind of some example and presented as an example to the world to show the benefit of the green transition, to show the benefit of the climate actions. That's the 2 points now we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. And indeed, it's good to hear that you are discussing with the US in a way what to put in place to replace those coal-fired power plants that indeed Korea will not finance anymore. From GGI's perspective, we indeed see many opportunities for that. And indeed, of course, that's exactly where we are working to prepare investable projects. And indeed, we see a lot of opportunities for Korean industry, for the private sector, to contribute technology, to contribute knowledge as well. And the other point you made was where there might be some lack of confidence in Korea that it's actually feasible to make this transition so quickly. And of course, you didn't make as much of a point of that, Ambassador Smith, but the UK is actually one country that has transitioned from 40% of coal in the energy mix to almost nothing in as little as 10 years. So that is the kind of experience, I think, that is also quite relevant to discuss, and hopefully we can come back to that a bit later in this discussion. But thank you for your thoughts there. Can we turn to Mr. An Yunji, the Senior Vice President of POSCO Research Institute, to have your thoughts on the same subject, please.
I've just been introduced. My name is An Yunji. For the purposes of my discussion, I would like to speak in my mother tongue, if I may. So I enjoyed listening to the presentations today, as well as the opening remarks made by the moderator. And I think that what we have to think about, especially when we talk about green transition, we have to think about the terms of the green transition, because the terms or the conditions of the UK are different from the conditions of Korea and the conditions of Japan, for example. All these countries have different contexts and conditions. I think within the paradigm of sustainable development, we have to think about carbon neutrality and a circular economy, circular product. That in and of itself is a very great, ambitious goal that we have to go towards. This is not really a goal for us. I think the goal here in Korea is green growth, because we want to grow in an eco-friendly way. And that means we want to try to lower the use of and the emissions of greenhouse gases while still maintaining a good level of growth. So we've already seen many countries set out their directionalities forward through their NDCs. They've submitted their NDCs to the UN, and many countries, including the Republic of Korea, have also submitted their visions and declared the visions for carbon neutrality by 2050. In fact, I think POSCO also has set out a vision like that as a corporation. But then it really comes down to the conditions of the green transition. And when there are these green products that are made or circular products that are made, we want these different companies to try to develop these different products and to have a market to sell these products. But we don't really know what this market is going to look like. We don't really know the actual conditions and the terms of what this market is going to look like. And the 2050 carbon neutrality vision is founded on the use of green energy, so solar energy, some portions of nuclear energy, and also green hydrogen as well. If we don't have these renewable energy transitions, then we simply cannot have carbon neutrality. That is why we have to also look at the country's specific statements on what they're going to do in terms of energy transition, literally specifically their energy fuel mix. So we have to look at how they're going to do this. So we understand the what, but we have to understand the how. And I hope that we can hear that in the P4G summit. When we talk about low carbon products or circular products, it's not that the technology isn't there. The technology is there for us to make them. We can make those products, but we don't have a market for those products. We don't know a pricing mechanism for these products. So if there's a market that is made for these products, and if there is maybe some time for us to lead into this building up of these markets, have a good pricing mechanisms for these markets, all of these different specific measures, then I think many countries would be more than happy to enter this market. So we need these policies and some sort of specific pricing mechanisms as well. And I think that for this to happen, the policies have to be consistent and they should not continue to change, because for these kinds of products, these green products or circular products, they're expensive to make. So when a company starts investing in them, they need to do it for the long haul. And that means it needs to be supported by consistent policies down the road. So we talk about green growth as a growth strategy, and also, many companies are requested to up their ESG efforts. And we also talk about green finance. With the green finance, we understand that to mean that many banks and financial institutions are also going to be participating in these green finance efforts. And I think that is also great. But again, it comes down to the how. How are these different financial institutions going to come into this sector as well? If you look at the Paris Agreement, it talks about carbon neutrality and 1.5 degrees. But if you look at Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, it talks about global collaboration, and it also sets forth a sort of a trading mechanism and the CDM, and trying to expand that concept of a CDM in a sustainable way and to allow for these international efforts. And in fact, even in internationally transferable mitigation efforts. So this is there in the article, and we understand the corporations understand them to be a sort of a slightly moderated version of the CDMs, but we still don't know the specifics of this as well. So, for example, with double counting, we understand what double counting is, but we don't know how it's going to be implemented, for example. And if a product is going to be made that meets these different requirements and can be supported with the right policy measures and the right pricing, then I think, and there is a market for this, then this would be a very good win-win for all of us. Right now, I think that there are many certain countries such as Japan and Singapore and Switzerland that are really working very closely on trying to finalize Article 6 implementation. I think that this is important for us in Korea as well. In Korea, we, along with many countries, have announced this vision of carbon neutrality for 2050, and that is great, and we have to get there. But if we ask ourselves what we're going to do to get there, how are we going to get there, we have to look at this carbon emissions peak for different countries. Carbon emissions peak is different from many countries. For EU and other advanced countries, it was in the 1990s. In Korea, it's in 2020. I think for China, it's 2030. The US is 2005. And this means the EU and the US and Korea have all said that they're going to lower emissions 1.5%, 2%, or et cetera. But we're working off different carbon peaks, carbon emissions peaks. So that is also something that we have to take into consideration. What Korea is trying to play an important role in is, as has been mentioned, Korea is a manufacturing powerhouse. So it wants to manufacture different products that are already being used around the world. If we can leverage these to also cut down on greenhouse gas emissions, then that in and of itself can be a good way for us to get towards our green growth target. And I think that, as has been mentioned by the moderator and the presenter, Korea can definitely and should definitely play a leading role in that regard. The financial side, with the banks and insurance companies, all of these different parties will have to come in because we want to create a market, as I mentioned, an economic mechanism. For example, when we create a taxonomy for green finance, there is the technology that is developed to cut greenhouse gases, and it has to lead to a lot of widespread activity in that market. So that is why I myself and other many people stress best available technology. And that is why we also talk about best available technology, and that has been applied in certain cases, even last year as well. So we want to try to create the right conditions for green finance and green finance players to also come into this market to allow us to try to get into this ambition. And that is also another thought that I wanted to share. And with the 2030 NDC and the 2050 carbon neutrality goals, I think that they need to be looked at a little bit differently. The 2030 NDCs in Korea, I think we are working on the ETS scheme. And with scope 1, 2, 3, we're on scope 1. Because we don't have an ETS market in Korea, we're on scope 2 in Korea. And I think in Europe it's scope 3, if I'm not mistaken. But with carbon neutrality, it's scope 1, 2, 3. And scope 3 is very complicated. If we don't minimize this, we cannot have carbon neutrality for the world. But this important area, as I mentioned before, there is this argument whether what the origin is for carbon neutrality. If there is this grand vision of carbon neutrality, what is important is not necessarily the ownership of, how we're going to determine where it came from, but we have to go towards this grand vision of carbon neutrality. So we have to go towards scope 3. And so the product aligned, our product, if a better product is being used in the markets and that can cut down on greenhouse gas emissions, then that would be great, because this is also something that can go in tandem with JCM, which is being argued by Japan on the Japan side. And if this can be discussed again at COP26, and many efforts can be made in that regard, then I think that many players will also engage in this and also invest as well. And they'll be more active in participating in these efforts.
You shared a lot of interesting thoughts. Indeed, we obviously share your ambition to have green growth still. And so do many of, I would say all of our member countries. We believe that it is possible, and Ambassador Jensen of Denmark has made in similar panels many comments that indeed in Denmark they have had this transition from fishing to oil to now producing turbines for wind power, and the perspectives he sees for countries like Korea to be a manufacturing hub for wind turbines in Asia, to indeed yes, it will require change in the industry, but there are opportunities indeed to start manufacturing, and there will be markets, we believe, replacing those coal-fired power plants with other products that Korean industry can provide. You in a way posed the question to, I think, Ambassador Smith, that I hope we might come back to. Not sure he knows the answer, but we do hope that COP26 will be the place where Article 6 will be finalized. And I can tell you that as GDGI, we work with 8-9 countries to prepare them, to prepare the governance, to prepare what is necessary in terms of MRVs, to measure those credits credibly, so that indeed companies like POSCO can engage in transactions once that the rules are clear. So I think you've raised some important points. Let's quickly go to our next speaker and hope that at the end of our 4 initial remarks we'll have a bit of time for discussion to come back to some of the things that you've raised. Can we go to Mr. Yunji Jong, the President of Korea Environment Institute, for your perspective, please?
환경
Before I move on to my presentation, I'd like to briefly introduce what Korea Environment Institute is. Well, KEI is an international organization that formulates the environmental policies for Korea. So this is the think tank organization. So what we do at KEI is to formulate ways how to achieve carbon neutrality. So we do the policy research at KEI. And as I said, I'm the president of the Korea Environment Institute. So we are in a place to listen to various opinions throughout the society. So I'd like to briefly touch upon several points. Carbon neutrality or net zero has become such a popular item in the Korean society. However, the discussions over carbon neutrality has only begun quite recently. My institute, 2 years ago, expected the need for a traditional New Deal. What is a traditional New Deal? That means we have to move on to the digital society and green society. And we also have to move on to human New Deal, which respects humanity. So that's the policy research we conducted in July 2019. And as you well know, COVID-19 broke out in January 2020. Back then, the government endorsed the Green New Deal, and the government promised to actively review the idea. So we were so pleased by the government's response. However, with the outbreak of COVID-19, all eyes were on the livelihood of the citizens. Well, we have lost so many jobs, and many people have lost their livelihood. So the environment was considered as a luxury. That is why we were not able to proceed with this Green New Deal, or the Korean version of the Green New Deal idea, but all at the same time, because we cannot continue the status quo, we have to bring about a fundamental change to the Korean society. And COVID-19 was such an important wake-up call. That is why we need to move on to the Green New Deal. Various parts of the society, including civic organizations, have been told by my institute. So finally, Green New Deal was adopted as one of the Korean New Deal last year. Up until that point, carbon neutrality was not an important topic to be discussed intensively. But last year, October, more specifically, the Korean government declared its commitment to carbon neutrality. And now we are talking about achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. We are formulating a scenario for that. And such a discussion has taken place in Europe for over 3 decades, and in such a short span of time, we have progressed the discussion. But well, this is something we have to work on further. So I'd like to ask for your understanding, as I had a brief conversation with Ambassador Smith. I told him that the Korean society is so dynamic. And to my understanding, this is a forum to celebrate P4G Seoul Summit. And why does Korea host P4G Summit? Korea, from the perspective of the international community, was the most impoverished country in the world in the 1960s, and in a short span of 60 years, it has become an OECD member country. In such a short span of time, how is it possible? Of course, we worked really hard and diligently, and we have supported the economic development and the growth and the industrial development, but the support from international community was indispensable. European countries and the advanced nations have extended their full support for Korea. That is how Korea has become an OECD member country. And the experience, the wisdom, as well as the knowledge should be shared with the international community. However, from the perspective of carbon neutrality, Korea has such a long way to go, because Korea's economic development has been achieved on energy consumption. So Korea has consumed, or Korea has emitted almost twice as much as the carbons. However, Korean society has changed so much, has completed the transformation in terms of its perspective. And now, as Korea successfully tackles carbon neutrality issue and this climate change issue, Korea will be able to set a good example for the international community. And P4G is all about the partnership and green growth. Well, this is for the sustainable development. And I do not think government effort alone can achieve this goal, and private sector cannot do this all by itself. If we put together all the efforts, then we might be able to achieve the goal. But this requires international cooperation, not just the efforts by one single country. No matter how much Korea emits carbons, but it is only 1.5% of the global emissions. If we successfully tackle carbon emissions, that does not solve the global climate change issue. There is not one single country that can successfully tackle or undermine global climate actions. So a single change cannot completely change the outcome. That is the reason why I'm telling you this is about not just energy transition, but all the aspects of our lives should be transformed in order to achieve carbon neutrality. This calls for communication. The current society is afflicted with conflict. Especially the senior citizens, they have limited digital access, they are not tech savvy. They do not know how to use various applications, not because they've done anything wrong, but because the society has changed so rapidly. In the process of carbon neutrality and the green transition, I think that will be done at the expense of many people, especially the underprivileged, in terms of information and the digital access. We have to include them. We have to ensure active communication. Otherwise, carbon neutrality will cause very serious social conflict and tension. So carbon neutrality is something we can achieve only when we can achieve a social consensus among all the social stakeholders. With this, I'd like to conclude my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for making the important point that society can only achieve net zero through partnership, which I think is a very welcome message in light of the P4G summit, of course. So can we please move to our last panelist of the session, Ms. Kim Toony, the Executive Director of the Korean Federation for Environment Management, for your contribution, please.
Hello, my name is Kim Toony, and I work at the Korean Federation Environment Movement. Recently, on April 30th, the National Pension of Korea opened a pension committee, and they reserve the decision on green finance to the next year. For the last 10 years, the National Pension Fund has been investing about 10 trillion won into different coal-fired emission plants, but they were not able to finalize their green investment principles at this April 30th meeting. And so our organization called on the National Pension Fund to try to continue to work on this issue and adopt some green principles at the next meeting. And another fact that I want to say is that President Moon Jae-in made an announcement at the April summit held by President Biden. And yes, he said that he's going to stop subsidies for overseas coal-fired power plants. But there are about 17 coal-fired power plants that are going to come online in Korea soon. However, there was no mention of these coal-fired power plants in Korea. And President Moon Jae-in gave just a sweeping sort of overview, a general statement only, without talking about the specific measures on these different coal-fired power plants in Korea and overseas. Korea, as you know, also adopted the Green New Deal, which is part of the economic stimulus package. I had the opportunity to compare Korea's Green New Deal with the European Green New Deal. With the European Green New Deal, it talks about new generation Europe. That was an expression that they use out of Europe. In Korea, however, we talk about digital New Deal, Green New Deal, fairness, inclusivity. We use these different words and these concepts, but I don't think we have a general direction of where Korea wants to head in the future. In the European stimulus package, it talks about international humanitarian aid also, but around that same time, Korea, while it is still a very developed country, its economic stimulus package was only domestically oriented without talking about any foreign aid. So I think that this is an area that Korea needs to work on as well. Right now in Korea, the concept of green transition is something that many people know. Everybody knows about this, a keyword. But if you ask someone, why do we need to do a green transition? Largely, people would say that we are going to be extinct. People are going to be extinct. Stanford University say that this grand mass extinction is happening at an unprecedented scale. And all of these different species are going to become massively extinct. This means that human happiness is also going to be put in crisis. So when we ask ourselves, why do we need green transition? We're really doing it for us. We're doing it for me. We're doing it for you. We're doing it for all of us. And so we're doing it for our economic benefit and our social benefit, and also for the sake of sustainability, that we have to engage in green transition in a way that we do not leave anyone behind. The Stockholm Institute announced a plan as well. And here it talks about the economy, the society, and the environment. And if we look at the report, it says that for the economy to go well and for the society to go well, we need a very healthy biosphere. So water, the environment, and climate. This is coming out of the Stockholm Institute. So if we have a very sound, very vibrant ecosystem and a good biosphere, then we can all be happy. But if we don't have that, then economy and society will suffer as a result. And the UN Secretary General's report on sustainability also was released not very long ago. Here it talks about low carbon, resilient, and inclusive growth and development is one that allows for a better earth, allows for better jobs, and decrease inequality and decrease inequity. But recently, we were seeing a lot of climate-related litigation. After the Paris Agreement was adopted, we've seen a lot of these different lawsuits that have been engaged. So from the 1986 to about 2000s, there are about over 1,000 lawsuits. And many of them were engaged after 2005. Many different plaintiffs, many different kinds of defendants. I think that we all have a question in our minds. Is this mission of carbon neutrality really possible? Many people wonder if we can achieve this goal. This is up to the governments, international organizations, and some people, and even corporations, who think that this is hard and this is impossible to do, such as cement makers or aerospace or truck manufacturers or shipyards. I think that it's these manufacturers and these companies who have to step up. So we need pressure from the civil society, but from many people who are here today. So we have to continue to put pressure on all of these different parties. This session is on carbon neutrality and sustainable development. I've talked to farmers and workers and fishermen, and the farmers say, I met a potato farmer. The potato farmer invested in his potato farm and invested about 100,000 Korean won and wasted all that money because of this extreme heat and of these erratic climate patterns. And when I met the farmers at Garorimman or Garorim Bay, they also said that all of these different the fisheries and the nursing fisheries that I've seen growing up have all disappeared. When I meet the laborers and workers in Ansan, they would say that climate crisis, I actually never thought that these people were going to be talking about climate crisis, but when I met the workers in Ansan, they said that we are contracted to work for these different European companies, and they said that 5 years down the road, all of the contracts that we have signed right now are going to be valid for 5 years in the future, but from 5 years on from then, we have to be certified as green if we want to do business with Europe. So there's a lot of these different dilemmas and different issues that many different interested stakeholders across Korea are very much concerned with. So I ask, for Korea, within SDGs, there are multi-stakeholders, workers, farmers, fishermen, all of these different stakeholders. But when we talk about carbon neutrality, are we considering fishermen? Are we considering the livelihoods of the farmers? Because I don't think so. And when we look at the Korean government often always talks about carbon neutrality. It almost never talks about sustainable development goals. There's this imbalance in the frequent use of these different terms. So for the country to develop, the environment is really a source of our food, a source of our water, a source of all these energy. So for us to lead sustainable lives, we need to engage in environmental protection, and everyone has to participate in these efforts. But I feel that some people are being left behind, especially when we talk about policy formulation, that workers, farmers, and fishermen are being neglected in this policymaking process. If I look at the data of other countries, in the case of Germany, they talk about a just full transition. The Philippines, they also have a law on green employment or green jobs. These policies do not necessarily have to only be on sustainable development or green transition. They can talk about both. So in Korea, we talk about green transition and SDGs. I actually think that SDGs should be more of the umbrella term, that it should be talked about more frequently because it is the overarching term. And if we want to build back better, we have to understand that we need to do SDGs. We need to achieve SDGs, and that it comes first, and that is the holistic framework ahead of green transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kim, for raising some indeed very important questions, indeed more specific questions for President Moon on indeed not only financing coal internationally, but what it will mean domestically. Indeed, a question from you on how Korea will green its ODA as well. And indeed, I thought the examples you gave from people in Korea experiencing climate change already, pointing out that it's not only mitigation, but also adaptation, which is what we hear from many of our countries, all over, from the small island development states to Africa, and the examples you gave here in Korea. I also thought it was very interesting that those workers were aware that there are markets for green products. What's more, companies will need to be certified green if they want to maintain their current markets. I thought that was an important point in response to Mr. Ahn's point that companies can provide green products if there are markets. Now, we have a little bit of time, so I'm hoping that all of the speakers will be able to give a short statement, just a few minutes, on what you have heard that you want to respond to. And indeed, Ambassador Smith, if we can start with you, you know, you were asked a bit maybe how it was possible for the UK to transition so rapidly out of coal, or whether you can say something about Article 6 in COP26, just to give you a few things you may want to address briefly. The on-off button, when you push the on-off.
Thank you very much. I'll try and do all of that. Yes, Article 6 is a really important objective of COP26. Getting the Paris rulebook completed and ready to implement in full is certainly one of the very important objectives on the agenda, and we hope to contribute as much as we can to getting that through. Thank you, Frank, for giving me a further opportunity just to say a little bit more about the UK experience. There are one or two things that I skipped over a little bit as I saw the clock catching up with me. So just to single out two things from the UK experience. One, as Frank, you mentioned, in 2012 we were still supplying more than 40% of our energy needs through burning coal. And by 2020 that figure had been reduced to 2%, and it is virtually gone now. In fact, many of the instances where coal is burned to produce electricity for the grid is simply a sort of practice run to make sure that the systems still work. And effectively, coal is no longer a part of our energy mix, and it will be entirely gone by 2024 at the latest. Yes, I agree with our colleague Mr. Ahn, who from POSCO, who says yes, we have to take into account different conditions in different countries in the world, but I think we also have to look at what are the urgent and inevitable objectives that we need to achieve. The United Kingdom was a country that employed hundreds of thousands of people mining coal not so long ago, and as I've just mentioned, not so long ago saw coal as an essential part of its energy generation and an essential component of its industrial structure. But we recognized that we couldn't simply say, those are the conditions, that's what our country is about, those are the conditions we have to put up with, so let's just do our best within that framework. We said, no, we have to change the framework. Again, as I mentioned in my speech, we thought it very important to legislate for climate commitments, to make them the law, and not simply something which we would try hard to achieve, but if we failed to achieve them, we'd say, oh, well, never mind, we did our best. They are things we have to do, and that it helped accelerate our departure from coal. Legislation also will help accelerate our departure from the use of internal combustion engines on our roads. It has also helped to accelerate the massive flow of finance into renewable energy, and that is not something that has just been directed. It's been helped by government action, but it is a trend that is in a sense fed itself, because the more money has gone into the sector, the cheaper the prices have become, the better the technology has become, the easier it has been to generate electricity in those renewable sectors, and so in some ways a virtuous circle is maintained. The last thing I would point out, again, just a couple of figures from the UK experience. In 30 years, up to 2020, our emissions were reduced by 44%. And over that period, our economy grew by 75%. So, again, from our experience, there is absolutely no contradiction between concentrated action to reduce emissions and ensuring our economy continues to grow. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Simon. Well, if we can turn to you, Jong, you will have noted a few pointed questions were asked for the government, and you're the closest we have to there. So I know it's not fair to ask you what President Moon will commit to in the P4G summit or what he will say to President Biden, but can you share a little bit about getting concrete in Korea on some of those challenges?
Maybe we have to wait one more day to reveal the concrete result of the summit. But I want to talk about 2 points regarding the comments of our panelists. First one is some business sector's concern. 2050, the net zero target is quite the longer term project. We need kind of some consistency, as Mr. And pointed out. In Korea, in the 30 years span, we will have 6 times change of the government. So we are very serious, and we want to see longer term the projection of this process. As you know, Korea, we have very famous catchwords, pali, fast and faster. But this time, we want to take a little bit slow and longer term the process. We will establish the Carbon Neutrality Commission this month, end of this month. Through this commission, we will have kind of open series of the public hearing to establish concrete targets, new upgraded NDC, and also new longer-term strategy. With the support and the participation of all stakeholders, public hearing, we will have enough political momentum to take this process by the 2050, the net zero targets. That's the one point. And the second one is the participation issue. So I think the member of this panel shows the symbolic meaning of the P4G summit. P4G is about the participation of all stakeholders. Until now, I don't know the preference of the Korean people, but we are very familiar with the government-led initiative in the introduction of a new policy or the change of the policy. But now we realized, actually we need the participation of all stakeholders and the interest groups. So we presented the P4G Summit as a good opportunity to change the decision-making process. So now that we establish a platform for the future generation through the P4G Summit, and introduce kind of some civil society session. Start is very small, but we will continue. Thank you.
Thank you. And indeed, you pointed out that these goals we discuss here have to be carried by at least 6 presidents till 2050. So we hope that these will become goals which are supported across party lines. Indeed, important when we discuss this with the National Assembly. We see in other countries also that some of these goals are not party politics, but are societal goals that are, we might differ on the exact method, but everybody supports some of those key goals. I think that's a very important point. If we may go back to Mr. Ahn. Mr. Ahn, you asked for markets for green products, and indeed, there are of course many other companies who have signed up for RE100, also requesting or requiring their value chains to be RE100, to be 100% renewable energy. And as Ms. Kim indicated, some markets might require green products. Is that an answer to your quest for markets? And indeed, is there any chance that POSCO will join initiatives like RE100?
Well, I am not the top decision maker, so I cannot give an affirmative answer right now. But I can tell you that POSCO as a whole is very much interested and committed to this. We've actually given a corporate vision last year on carbon neutrality. So, as I mentioned before, Without government sourcing of renewable energy, such as eco-friendly hydrogen and all these different renewable energy sources, we cannot have carbon neutrality. That is why I think POSCO is also interested in RE100. But more importantly, we are very much interested in green hydrogen. And if we cannot have a proper source, a stable source of hydrogen, then I think that for the steel industry as a whole, not just for POSCO, but for all steel makers, it will be very challenging situation. So for us, green hydrogen is very important. Sourcing green hydrogen is important. So that is why we are trying to focus on our cooperation with the government, but it's not going to be easy.
Thank you for pointing out the importance of green hydrogen. We share that with you. We hope to be able to contribute a bit to that agenda as well as GDI in collaboration with companies here. I was just shared by one of the organizers a question from the audience that was a bit, I'm going to address that to you, Mr. Yoon. Can we work collaboratively with other countries on, for instance, energy policy? Can we collaborate on smart grids? Do we have to solve all these issues by ourselves, like as Korea by ourselves, or are there opportunities to reach some of those goals like carbon neutrality in collaboration with others? Could you say a word about that possibly?
Yeah.
Before I was inaugurated as the president of KEI, as served as a member of Scientists Without Borders, and I also served as a president of Available Technologies. So I went to see many least developed countries, Ethiopia, Tanzania, to identify areas where we can extend support. I was deeply involved in such areas of activities. And I came to see that there are many poor nations across the globe. Well, they have a food shortage, they do not have any clean water, and they have limited access to clean water. And they have various other issues and limitations. Unless those issues are successfully tackled, then we cannot say we can jointly achieve carbon neutrality or carbon neutral society, especially on a global front. As Korea is an OECD member country and there are many advanced economies throughout the globe, we need to focus solely on collaboration, international collaboration and cooperation only for the sake of the cooperation rather than pursuing a short-term economic gains. We should be able to support and promote in those developing countries so that they can actively part in this carbon neutrality initiative. And I hope this P4G can serve as an important platform to have such a discussion.
Reminding us that indeed we should strive to achieve the NDCs and the SDGs together and in collaboration. Well, we're coming to the end of our panel, so I think, Ms. Kim, to you the honor to have the last words in our session. As a representative of civil society, you've been listening, you've given us some important advice and questions from people you've spoken to. What would you like to share as your last advice to this panel and to the members of the National Assembly who are listening?
So I think that right now we have the mayor of Dangjin present. And when I had the opportunity to visit Dangjin a few years ago, I remember there were some elderly generation in Dangjin who were very anxious about the coal-fired power plants there. And they called it, I think it was the swamp of evil, I think. And I think that the mayor of Dangjin came in, this new mayor of Dangjin, and he was able to clean up the site. So thank you very much. But I know that POSCO or Samsung, they have these coal-fired power plants in Gangneung and elsewhere. The residents in those areas are suffering from the coal-fired power plants there, and they're asking for the construction of these coal-fired power plants to be seized. So I would like to raise awareness of that to the people present here today so that you can also make some requests to these different industry stakeholders. There's a lot of conflict between renewable energy and different stakeholders as well. There are about 50 different kinds of environmental organizations across the country, and there are certain regions that suffer from renewable energy as well, specifically maybe wind farms. And for some local chapters of environmental CSOs or civil society organizations that don't have a lot of renewable energy presence, they would talk about coal-fired power plants. And so there is a little bit of a conflict between these traditional power plants and renewable power plants as well within these different environmental CSOs. So when there is this conflict between environment and energy, we have recently said we've called upon MOTI, the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy, and also the Ministry of Environment to try to set up all of these different roundtables to allow for interested stakeholders to come in, especially members of the residents, to come in to talk about their problems and issues. When you go out to these different communities, we see that the residents are really suffering because they're literally living there where these different wind farms and all of these different energy sites are. So I'd like to ask stakeholders to go to these sites and see what the reality of the situation is and engage in productive discussions with these community members. And for the Ain coal-fired power plant, we've asked them to convert to biomass as well. But I hope that POSCO can also think about converting their power plants to more renewable fuels. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Kim. I think with those questions, we're coming to the end of this first panel. Of course, there is still a second panel, but I hope that you in the audience found this a fascinating discussion as well, and that you'll join me in thanking the presenters and the panel members for their contribution. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Well, thank you very much. We'll take a short break.
Do you remember your childhood playing outside? I remember blue skies, breeze, birds chirping, and even dirt on our hands.